Hi everyone, I'm Marusya Bociurkiw. I'm a filmmaker and writer and the co-director of the Studio for Media Activism and Critical Thought. Um, we bring media, scholarship, and activism together and intervene into the Neoliberal Academy. We're a Toronto Ryerson University-based research center with no fixed address, which has also allowed us to expand into this virtual community and reclaim the common good of the university. We organize a variety of events, symposia, seminars from an international perspective on issues like feminist queer race archives, crip activism, anti-Black racism, Indigenous media, and we try to create a radical feminist and anti-racist space for students and faculty in the university and beyond. Thank you to our funder, the Faculty of Communication and Design, and the folks that have helped us make this event happen, Kala Evans, Jedida Nabwangu, and Meera Govindasamy, who's going to do our land acknowledgement.
Hello, everyone. I'm Meera. So although we are gathered virtually today, really nothing has been made more clear to me through the past 3 nights of events than the fact that location and the place that you are still matters in this pandemic. Yesterday, the City of Toronto released a map of the ways that COVID cases are distributed throughout the city. And unsurprisingly, the cases that are most concentrated they're most concentrated in lower income areas. In another sense, even as we're engaging in online organizing through movements that we'll hear from this evening, like Keep Your Rent Toronto and Caremongering, it still always matters where you're located and who your neighbors are. So with this in mind, I'm still going to do a land acknowledgement. So I personally am located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas. I'm a settler here, and my ancestors are Tamil immigrants from South Africa who left to escape colonial oppression. And then on the other side, my ancestors are white European settlers. Yesterday, our speaker, Alex McClellan, said that white entitlement to public space is a main driver of the COVID-19 pandemic. So framed in this way, it's very obvious how settler colonialism continues to function in the pandemic. So in an effort to avoid having this land acknowledgement be what Eve Tuck would call a move to innocence, but nothing more, again, the studio would like to propose a few places that we as settlers, as the studio, and then anyone who feels that they have the capacity to do so can donate. So I'm going to paste some links in the chat, and then we'll also share links to these places after the event. So the first, and these are the places that have been suggested as places to share throughout the week, and we thought this as the final night, we could kind of just share all the same places again. So the first one is Nanook, who is fundraising for Indigenous youth outreach in Toronto's West End. The Native Women's Resource Centre, which is a community-based organization dedicated to providing resources and support to urban Indigenous women and their families. Nami Res, which is an organization that provides transitional and permanent housing to Aboriginal men experiencing homelessness in Toronto. And then finally to the Innistoten Camp Legal Fund. So I'm going to share all those places in the chat, and then, as I said, they will also be available at the end on our Facebook page if you didn't get a chance to have a look before. Additionally, just a couple of housekeeping items before we get moving. So if you would like to submit a question, we're going to leave about half an hour at the end for questions. So you can submit a question by using the chat function in Zoom. If you can't find the chat, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a little button that says more, and then there should be a chat option visible there if it's not already visible to you. You'll have the option there to send a message to everyone, which will send a message to everyone in the group, which is fine if you want to celebrate our speakers that way. And then if you want to send a question specifically, you can submit that to Jedediah, or Jed is the name in the chat. And Jed will, either you can indicate that you would like your question to be read out loud by somebody else, or you can indicate just in brackets that you want to speak your own question. And then we'll kind of call on you when it's your turn, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So that is how questions are working. I also wanted to suggest that because it might be overwhelming to see so many people in the Zoom, if you notice that when people are talking, you see everyone's screen, at the top right-hand corner of your Zoom, you should see the option to change to speaker view. And that will just kind of align things so that only the person who's presenting will be the main person visible to you. Anything else? Yeah, you probably got a message when you entered the Zoom that this was being recorded, but for tonight, we're just recording for the studio's own archival purposes. So, and in general, none of your questions in the chat will be recorded, and you won't be recorded, only our speakers. Okay, and that's everything. I will hand things back to Marusya.
Okay, great. And Jed, I wonder if you could unshare the screen at this point. Yay. So yesterday, the murder of George Floyd marked our discussion quite heavily. And today we gather under the shadow of yet another incident of police brutality, this time in Toronto, the murder of Regis Korchinski-Paquette, a 29-year-old Black woman living in High Park who was pushed off a balcony by Toronto police. So we're thinking of Regis today, as well as the many other people of color who have been killed by police in Toronto. Many of our speakers in the past 3 days have often touched upon what Beverly Bain yesterday called, quote, the intersection between capital, COVID-19, race, and settler colonialism, end quote. Whether it's insufficient data on numbers of COVID cases in Indigenous communities, as detailed by Courtney Skye on Monday, or the different ways that Black and white bodies are policed in public space. We've talked about the invisibility of undocumented migrants in pandemic discourse, how science is not neutral towards brown and Black bodies, how criminalizing a virus doesn't work, and how the responsibility of white people to understand mutual aid beyond our own circles is urgent. Tonight, as we talk about activism across social distance, I'm hoping that we can start figuring out how to build forms of collective power that advance justice for all people. It's been an amazing 4 nights. This is our final night. I think my hair has actually gotten longer since we began. I don't know if anyone has attended all 4 nights. Give us a thumbs up if you have. I feel like we should give you a prize. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and thank you to our speakers. We're very honored to have you here as well. So the world as we know it has fallen away, and in doing so has revealed the structural inequality that was always there. But many fine people like our speakers tonight are working hard to remake this world in the name of social justice. We wanted to end our 4-day marathon of radical thoughts on a pandemic with a call to action as we hear from artists and activists who did not fall into lethargy or obsessive bread baking, but instead got to work as soon as the pandemic began to innovate and to organize. So we're going to start with housing. We've heard a lot of stories about people losing their jobs, being evicted by merciless landlords. Here's someone who organized her entire building to do a rent strike. Paterson Hodgson is a Toronto-based artist, illustrator, and community organizer. They live in Parkdale and is a member of Keep Your Rent, a tenant movement demanding rent forgiveness during COVID-19. I really like one of their slogans, tenants keep your rent, landlords keep your distance. So Paterson, welcome.
Thank you. I like that bread baker roast. No shade to anyone baking bread, but I laughed. Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Paterson Hodgson. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a white settler of European descent, and I'm an artist and community organizer here in Parkdale. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about my history and what led me to be sort of becoming involved with organizing here in Toronto. I'm mostly going to talk about Keep Your Rent, just because it's all I do and think about, and how our organizing has evolved over the 3 months of two, 3 months of lockdown. As you know, like things, changed rapidly and are still rapidly changing. And a great thing about working class organizing is that we can adapt quickly as well. So I'm going to share some images and comics. And if you like what you see, you can follow me on Instagram. I'm just going to share screen and wait. Okay, so in 2016, I moved to Toronto. I made this comic last year after living here for a while. So I moved to Toronto mostly to play music, but I ended up making mostly art. In 2017, the bar I worked for closed and I went full-time art, and it was my side hustle, and then it became my main hustle, and is 3 years later. Oh, it won't let me go to the next one. Oh, there we go. Anyway, I'm just going to show you a couple images as I talk. They're all on my website if you need to see them again. I don't think you will need to, but anyway, so in 2017, Parkdale Organize had their Metcalf rent strike here in Parkdale, and that got a lot of media attention, and that's how I found out about them. And I was living in Parkdale, and I mostly found out through the news. Like, I didn't even know what was going on. And then in 2017, I moved to a building called West Lodge, which is where I live now. And it's a 2-building high-rise. They're both 19 floors. So there's a lot of people living here, thousands of people living here. For the most part, people living here are like lower class, like low income, working class. A lot of people on fixed incomes, a lot of people on ODSP, on seniors pensions, but also a lot of new Canadians, a lot of families from like all over the place, and a high density, super high density in the apartments. They're big apartments, and a lot of them have a lot of people living in them. Just to give you a sense of what the building is like. And I didn't organize my whole building. So there's thousands of us. So like, it's not that impressive. But anyway, so basically in 2018, after living here for a little while, a company called Timber Creek bought our building, and the Timber Creek Asset Management, and they are over $10 billion company. They own buildings all over the world. They are a Canadian company. And they have a history of what they've described as putting a building through a car wash, which ultimately means displacing 100% of the original tenants, renovating and replacing them with new tenants that can pay a higher rent. And usually those people are white. And sort of like middle class or upper middle class. So they bought our building in 2018 as part of the Wynn portfolio, which was our old landlord, the Wynn family. They're basically slumlords that are millionaires now. And before that, Timber Creek also owned 200 Dufferin, which is a building in Parkdale, kind of almost in Parkdale, that has actually already had this process happen. Basically no original tenants are living there. And it also happened to, you may have heard of Herongate, a community in Ottawa that experienced Timber Creek's process where they displaced over 100 families, which was one of the largest mass evictions in Canada to ever happen. So those people were mostly people of color. A lot of them were Somali, and they've been scattered all over Ottawa. So not only are they paying higher rents now, they're not with their community. So it's horrible. They've actually launched a human rights complaint against them, and it's definitely worth reading about. There's a lot of information online about that. So in winter 2019, this comic is about some organizing that we did, and it was my first experience in organizing. And it was just a little action. Basically, there was a flood in my building and it damaged a lot of stuff. And then on top of that, Timber Creek had just taken over the building and they were really backlogged in repairs and everyone was getting upset. So what we did was we collected repair forms, we did door knocking, and we delivered those repair forms to our head office, Timber Creek's head office, which is in Rosedale. And honestly, like, I think that they were going to do the repairs anyway. They did speed them up and that was great. But what was really amazing about that action is that it just introduced me to all these new people in my building that I had never met before. And that really laid the foundation for why some of the organizing has been successful here at West Lodge again, because we're just building. And like, that's what anyone who's been involved with organizing knows, that it takes a long time to build. And, you know, having that action last year happen has really helped us this time. So right after that, I designed this poster for Park to Organize. We did a rally in June that was neighborhood wide, and it was in response to a lot of the cuts that were coming down the pipe from the PC government. And a lot of teachers were involved in organizing that because there was a lot of school cuts. So that rally was also really cool. And that was also mostly happened so that we could lay that groundwork, start getting people excited about organizing and aware of it and understanding that it's a thing we can do. We don't have to wait for anyone else to save us. So then I'm just gonna fast forward all the way to March. So March, COVID hits where we go into lockdown. And in the last week before March, basically Keep Your Rent is launched. Park to Organize launched Keep Your Rent, mostly because the members of Park to Organize were like, we can't pay our rent. We need to, we're just gonna have to organize a rent strike, because if you withhold your rent or can't pay it in isolation, it's very likely that you will just get evicted. Like, you won't be able to fight that on your own. So they knew they knew that there were other people in the same situation as them. I reached out to them wondering if they were going to do this rent strike thing, and eventually they decided that they were and brought me in, and I made this image for them. And one of the reasons I made this image like this is because I wanted to represent people who are living in buildings and houses, and it just felt like a really simple image, and it did really well. I'm like really proud of it, and my mom loves to send me articles that it shows up in, which is fun. So our organizing leading into April was launch and awareness. Like, we wanted to get posters out as much as possible. Our Facebook group grew to about 6,000 members in a couple of weeks. The organizing around that was only calling, emailing, trying to get people aware that this is happening, to know that they can withhold their rent, that they're not alone. Then we fast forward to May, or well, I guess April, but leading into May. The organizing scenario kind of shifted. It became more, because CERB was announced. And when CERB was announced, in some ways it undermined our organizing, because people started being like, well, I'm getting CERB, shouldn't I give that to my landlord? And then our messaging became like, you live in Toronto, like, what's $2,000 going to do for you, really? But also, there's only 4 periods of CERB. Is that going to last you until, when's your job coming back? You don't know. And we were really trying to drive home like this uncertainty, which sounds kind of mean and sad, but is just actually true. You know, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know when we're going to open up again. And so this poster got made for leading into May, which is a bit scary and sinister, but effective. And then, so also during April, we started taking our organizing offline, off Facebook. The Facebook group, we're hearing from someone from Caremongering, so I'm sure that they can relate. It ballooned very fast, and the kinds of posting that was happening in there was not super productive. And so we started creating neighborhood pods, because connecting people that are close together became really important, and remains very important. So keep your CERB and stay off Facebook, became like our next kind of thing. So then May 1 hits. In the middle of May, we staged our first action, which was a socially distanced visit of landlords' homes. We went to 2 homes in Forest Hill that were like 2 blocks away from each other, and massive mansions. It was very upsetting. And a lot of like really nice dogs, which was fun to see, but also extremely upsetting to see these $1,000 dogs. Anyway, and this photo was taken, you know, we had people from Mississauga, from Scarborough, and from Parkdale come, and it was super well organized. It was super, we had got really good weather, which was great. And I think more actions like this are going to happen in June. This is our first try at it, and you know, we got a lot of media exposure. During, hey, oh, there we go. And so during May, our focus has really been on escalation, how to escalate in your building. And the plan, everyone's planning differently in every building, because, you know, working class power, it really has to do with working class people choosing for themselves. And so each building is doing what they feel comfortable with, what they're interested in doing. So one thing we're doing here at West Lodge, we had a socially distanced tenant meeting, which was awesome. And I'll actually just tell you some of the numbers. Like right now, I have like about 60 people that say they're keeping their rent, which seems kind of low for how many units there are. But is actually quite a feat, because my building is kind of notoriously difficult to organize. And we had about like 10 or 15 people show up to our tenant meeting, which was really good. And we decided that we're going to do an action next week where we are going to do a bit of a rally here in between our buildings, and then deliver a large size letter to our office. Even though it's closed, it's kind of going to be a symbolic message, because I'm going to talk a little bit about how COVID has affected our organizing. But I think it's always really important, like, for people to see that it's happening, and that's harder right now because we can't see them face to face. But so we're going to do a bit of a rally, and then this poster is for June, and our messaging is actually shifting again as the government doesn't pay attention to us. Doug Ford has not really responded to us in any way, except that yesterday a pretty damaging bill to tenants' rights actually was like rushed through and passed, which weakens some tenant rights in regards to hearings and speeds up some evictions. And so that's basically the only response that we've had from the government. And so our new message is no COVID evictions. No COVID evictions, not now, not ever. And so we've shifted from keep your rent to keep your CERB, and we're to no COVID evictions. Like, our organizing is broadening every single month. It's getting wider and wider as we gain power, as we build power amongst ourselves. Do I have, oh, that's my last picture. So I'll just stop sharing maybe and go back to just talking. Sorry, I have some little notes for myself. I'll just talk about, so during this time, like, I think some of the prompts that Ryerson gave me were about, you know, how do we show care when we're social distancing? How do we protest? How do we organize? How do we be political during this time when we can't be together? And I think during this time of social distancing, there's still so much room to connect. And I feel like we're really lucky to live in this time with all, technology is kind of bad, but it's very useful, obviously. I mean, we're here in virtual conference land or whatever. But nothing can really replace that face-to-face conversation with your neighbor, where you're trying to like figure out where you can relate, where you can connect on an issue, and how you can organize together. But like, to be perfectly honest, I'm actually making connections during this time in ways that I never have. And some of that is because of urgency. I think, you know, adversity always breeds creativity. And although I would never wish a global pandemic on anybody, I think that this is a huge wake-up call, and people are feeling, you know, people are mobilizing, people are radicalizing, people are becoming aware of, you know, how the system doesn't work, how landlords don't work. Like the idea that a landlord should have the same income now that they did before COVID, but we, the worker, we, the tenant, should make that happen for them when our job is gone, is like, there's a disconnect there, and people are recognizing it like in ways that they never did before. And so I think, yeah, I think this comes from knowing that this is so big, and that we are all going through it together. I'm not a massive fan of like, we're all in this together, because I think it kind of erases oppression, and it erases the fact that like people are poor and people are rich. Like there's actually a difference here. And seeing those signs in a store window, the Honest Ed ones, if you've seen them, like that doesn't make me feel good. That just reminds me that like Toronto's being gentrified, and like a pillar of Toronto got torn down. But we are in this together within our class. Like I am in this together with people in my building in a way that we've never felt connected before. I have very little in common with my neighbor who has kids. I don't have kids, or I'm an artist. Like I'm so privileged, I'm my own boss. And there's other people who, you know, like are factory workers or whatever kind of worker they are. Like we're just different. We have different interests and different finances. And like there's people in my building, I know they're sending all their money home for people that they're trying to sponsor to come to Canada. Like there's such wide differences between everyone here in my building, but we all live here, and we're all dealing with this landlord that is ignoring us, and we're dealing with the fact that our jobs are gone, things like that. Yeah, talking to my neighbor about what they're going through and helping each other is becoming, it's always great, and it's hard right now as well, but I think it's also kind of happening more. I mean, we're going to hear from Caremongering, and like I think Caremongering is a great example of, you know, people who maybe like didn't care at all about engaging politically before this, and now they're driving around food to people. I don't actually know how much time I have left. I have like one paragraph. I'm okay. Okay. Yeah, so I was gonna say that like the thing about, so organizing in time of COVID, it's hard, it's difficult. It's also actually a kind of an opportunity. Like we're all going through this terrible thing, so you know, we all have something to rally to or get together with. It's also actually really making it more accessible in some ways for if people have access to technology. It's making it more accessible for people who are, for instance, disabled, or people who don't have a lot of energy or time. So I think like everything going online is like actually really cool. But yeah, building trust and power, it is so much work. It's always so much work, and it's in some ways it's more difficult right now, but it's not so much more difficult than it was before. It was hard before, but it is work that lasts. And so even though it is difficult right now, I think if you're laying down that groundwork, if you're making connections, if you're building trust amongst yourself and your community and amongst working class people, like I'm really excited about this time, even though it's really hard. And yeah, I feel like I've said everything that I wrote down to say, but I was gonna mention, I'm much better at, like, I love answering questions. I'd much rather like be in conversation with someone. So like, please feel free to ask me any questions about Keep Your Rent, about anything, but like, or art or whatever. And I am on Instagram, and you can Google me or whatever. Anyway, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Paterson. It was great to hear about the work you're doing, see your drawings, which are amazing, and also to hear about how you're making connections at this time in ways that you never have. Artists and activists have been using online platforms for a long time, and one of those folks is my comrade, Mita Hans. I met Mita through a crazy culture jamming project called the Lesbian Billionaires, meant to expose the evil workings of Toronto corporate pride at the time. Mita Hans is a third-generation East African-born Sikh, now calling Toronto home. Her first memory of community care stemmed from helping others fleeing from Idi Amin's reign of terror in Uganda. She spent 2 decades volunteering with the Canadian Alliance in Solidarity with Native People, learning how to be an Indigenous ally. She brought Indigenous and Sikh communities together to feed hungry people in Allen Gardens, with the Siva Kitchen program that feeds hundreds of meals every weekend is in its 4th year. She co-founded Buddy Up TO, a program that allows marginalized people feeling unsafe or targeted in the city to buddy up and travel safely. And most famously, this local hero started Caremongering as a community care mutual aid group to meet the challenges of COVID-19. And there are now over 300 satellite groups across the planet with over 1 million people using caremongering to replace fear with acts of community care. So please welcome my friend, Mita Hans. And I think you have to unmute.
Thank you so much for that. Shelby mentioned that home is exactly 171 kilometers away from her mom. And that got me thinking that that seems to be a theme with this talk today of home and the places that we call home. I call Toronto home right now, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee first, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit last, and a very broad, disparate group of people now. And with Paterson's talk about the rent strike and how home is a mutable thing, it changes. I got to thinking while you were talking about what home is and how home is a place in the heart. And it's a place that we call community, that we call a place where we connect. And those places are home. Caremongering, for me, this home that I've created for an online group of currently 25,000 people in Toronto. We just hit that milestone this week, and about 1 million people around Toronto, around the world, in about 300 different groups. And the places that they call home, what unites us is this idea that we need to somehow make safe the places around us, the people around us, and how do we help? How do we help that happen? In 2011, I was at a lecture at U of T, and Angela Davis was speaking with Ward Churchill. And Ward Churchill is an old Indigenous activist, and he talked about when we come together and challenge the powers, we should not speak truth to power. We think of it that way, but that's not really appropriate because the powers aren't listening. What we should do is speak truth to people. And that struck me, and I was sitting there, and I just bought a new BlackBerry. That was my first mobile device, my first introduction to technology that was mobile. And I'd never used Twitter. I'd never used Facebook, or I was on Facebook, but not Twitter yet. And Angela Davis started speaking. And Angela Davis talked about building community and being in touch with what's happening around you and bringing people together. And at that time, it was in the winter, Egypt was going through revolution. And there was a hashtag on Twitter, January 25th. And while Angela was talking, I started thinking that she's talking about 1960s and 70s and organizing. And there's all this happening right now, happening in this moment. How do I tap into that? And while I was sitting listening to her, I tapped on my BlackBerry and went onto Twitter and went on to find the hashtag January 25th. And what happened when I logged on to that is that there was a demonstration happening in Tahrir Square where people were tweeting in live real time that they were being hurt. They were being assaulted by the police. They were having concrete blocks thrown at them. And somebody tweeted, "My friend has just been hit in the head with a concrete block. He's going unconscious. How do I help him?" And I had my phone in my hand, and I reached out to my aunt, who's a doctor in Ottawa, and I said, this is happening in Cairo, and how does she help? And she said, "Get her to take him," and she gave me the first aid instructions on how to deal with this injury. So my aunt in Ottawa is helping a person who has been hurt in a police assault on a demonstration in Cairo, while I'm sitting in Toronto talking, listening to Angela Davis speaking. And I thought, that's connection. This is how we use technology. This is how we bring people together. And everything that I've done since then has been how do we bring together multiple platforms? And when I started Caremongering, I thought it was going to be in my neighborhood helping a few people. And within hours, it grew beyond my expectation. By the next day, we had 600 people join and say, how can we help? And it started growing and growing. And then we had 2,000. And then we heard Obama is tweeting about us. And this was kind of mind-boggling. That's Obama's tweet talking about caremongering. The BBC did an article on us, and that kind of went viral, and it started going out into the world. And we started getting people from around the world sending us photographs of what they were doing. They started building their own caremongering groups. I had invented the word, a portmanteau of, somebody had said, you know, with COVID, you're scaremongering. Just stop that. Stop that. You're giving us all these instructions. This is going to happen and this is going to happen, and you're worrying us. And I said, I'm not to scare you. This is coming from a place of caring, not of fear. I'm caremongering. So I invented this word that night, and I started the Facebook group, and caremongering took on a life of its own and became something of a movement. We currently have over 300 groups around the world and over 1 million people, and it's growing. And each community that starts it does it in a way that it's responsive to their particular community. They will, so some are political, highly political, and we started it with the notion that to live on Indigenous territory, to live in our bodies that are of color, that are disabled, that are older, who the most vulnerable are, it's all political, that we would not be in the situation that we are in if it wasn't political, that 3 tiers of government have failed us, have left us with inadequate resources, have left us with inadequate PPEs, have left us with inadequate ways of feeding ourselves and housing ourselves. As Paterson was saying, how do we afford rent when we are now jobless, when we have been locked out of our lives? So we looked at how we would come together in our different places with our caremongering. And what Ward Churchill has said is, people cannot speak to power. Power doesn't listen. People have to talk to people and speak their truth to people. So people started doing what the governments failed to provide us with, of providing food, of providing information, of where do we find childcare, how do we share, now that we're jobless, can we do something else? Can we make masks since we don't have them available? How do we look after each other? And from that the groups started taking on a life of themselves, of their own, we developed groups in South Africa where their needs were very, very different in Cape Town than they were in Malaysia. Malaysia got hit with the pandemic at the same time that they got an influx of refugees. They had Rohingya refugees coming in that were abandoned by Bangladesh, so they ended up in Malaysia. And what hit me with caremongering and how it had taken on a life of its own was, can I see the Malaysian pictures? Hang on, let me just show you what some of those other groups are. There we go. They were taking packages out to these refugees. There was a camp of 300 that were stranded out in a remote area, and they had run out of food. And when caremongering got word of it, a group of people got together. We can just go through these slides quickly. That when they got word of it, they were able to amass food and take it out to these 300 people. They were able to look after these babies that had been stuck in orphanages. Oops. Sorry about that. The next one. That were stuck in orphanages and had no access to food. So they were running out, and they were bringing food to the refugees. I'll let you see the video. I think it's playing again. Can we stop that? Okay. So this is some of what's happening in Malaysia in caremongering, in how the groups are operating very differently and different needs. And what struck me and at the beginning of this was that we can use caremongering as a framework for future emergencies. We have climate change coming up. We have the locust swarms that are giving food insecurity to areas around the world. What happens if we build mutual aid networks to help each other out during this? That if these refugees in Malaysia were in dire need, somebody sitting in Toronto can reach out and help them. What an amazing thing it could be when climate change hits, if this framework is in place where we can start reaching out and saying who needs what, how do we get it to who needs it the most, identify the needs of the most vulnerable without waiting for governments to step in, because we know that they're unable to do what they need to do, and in some cases unwilling to do what they need to do. So it's going to have to be up to the people to look after ourselves and to look after each other.